Deixa eu
Ele já fez várias vezes, mas a gente pode fazer tempo de vai crescer. Eu acho que mas daria para fazer já, mas aí deve já. Não, mas o que a gente pode combinar? 6 no ano que vem. A gente vai lá e vai também nessa aula. E qual é o mais que daí, mas aí não vai ficar eu acho que
Posso te mandar o PowerPoint?
Não quer abrir direto ali, não? Manda para o seu e-mail alguma coisa.
Aí também ia ter que abrir, né?
Quer mandar para o meu e-mail? Eu abro ali?
Quero, pode. É que é tanto negócio de controle de
Não, então.
que me dá uma preguiça. Tem um negócio de segurança?
Por fazer uma depois falou que o Léo está no começo.
Não, não, não. Não, né? Só para a gente. Não, né? Só para a gente. Depois eu e aí, certo, então. Não, você acabou de ver. Não, claro. Estão aqui. Nós não vemos tempo. Eu vou olhar esses coisas também. Isso a gente já fez. Hoje a gente vai ter. Não, a gente faz o não, você vai ver, não tem aula. Não, a gente também canaliza. Estamos ficando sem tempo.
Também fazer mais tarde. Não, seria
Não, você pode pagar uma. Se não pegou dois, eu pago uma. Se não pegou uma, eu ela vai ser registrada. Eu não consigo. Semana.
Sim, 3 minutos. Para mim,
Tem que relaxar o seu caso. Just stay. Eu comprei na Amazon. Esse mesmo, ele falou que a boa era mas essa eu li
português. A gente vai pedir para ela falar o mais devagar possível. As perguntas que vocês tiverem, se vocês quiserem fazer as perguntas em português, a gente dá um jeito de se ajudar na tradução para que ela entenda quais são as perguntas e em seguida ela responde em inglês também. Tá? Então, vamos tentar falar do jeito que cada pessoa se sente mais confortável. Tá bom?
Tem. Bruno, vai embora.
Por favor, vai. Obrigada.
O negócio para nossa segurança, então, só não.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. And before I begin, first let me say thank you to Professor Tuna for this lovely invitation, and to the School of Law, the Department of Law, for this lovely invitation to come here to speak to all of you, not just today, for a few more days. It's very seldom that scholars get asked to come and speak for days and days and days about things that we love to speak about. So it's a real privilege, and I really appreciate it. And I want to say thank you so many times for this privilege. It's my first time on this side of the world, on this part of the world. So it's all very new for me and very exciting. Please accept my apologies that I don't understand the history of Portuguese. Maybe a few more times and I'll learn a few words, but my apologies for not being able to do that yet. I see there's a stand here. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So what I want to do is, this presentation is the beginning of a series. This is a public presentation. I know many of you are here now, but you may not be in the next two classes in the short course. What I want to do is still set this as one discussion, which we can continue in the short course as well. So for those of you who are coming, we'll continue this there, but we'll begin here, we'll get started here. Some of the ways in which the ideas that I want us to think about as we're talking. For today, some of the ideas are around intersectionality, decoloniality, the idea of pietistic agency, critical legal studies. The next time we speak, we'll also speak about secularism, competing rights, constitutionality, and movement building. And then finally, we'll expand to subjectivity. Yeah.
É isso que eu vou.
Esse é o canal.
Eu acho que sim, vai colocar essa.
Eu vou mostrar lá de dentro desse tudo, né? Tem que falar com os outros canais.
Não, às vezes são quase.
Será que
Corrente mesmo.
é um
Outro
vídeo?
muito jogo.
That's right. Okay. So we begin a discussion on the ways in which gender operates in Muslim family law and community responses to this. We begin by exploring some of the key legal questions for Muslim feminist legal reform. But before I do that, I also want to interrogate some conceptual and political paradigms that function at the intersections of Islam and feminism. Once we have clarity on this, we'll read a whole bunch of scholars and their different approaches to gender in Islamic law. And the final aim is to offer an assessment of what political and personal commitments there are at stake in the process of law reform, of living pietistically, so living with a religious conviction, and Muslim feminist aspirations for living in the fullness of ourselves, living a feminist life. So we begin with Sarah Ahmed, who says, living a feminist life does not mean adopting a set of ideals or norms of conduct, though it might mean asking ethical questions about how to live better in an unjust and unequal world, how to create relationships with others that are more equal, how to find ways to support those who are not supported or are less supported by social systems, and how to keep coming up against histories that have become concrete, histories that have become as solid as walls. The feminists in the room will know what that is like. Amongst my arguments, when we talk about Muslim women and gender and Islamic law, is the idea that the concept Muslim woman and the concept of Islamic law, if you understand it as Sharia, function as what I call deterministic screens, like concrete walls, concrete histories. These have become walls. And Muslim feminist legal reform encounters histories of law, religion, and gender, which act like concrete boundaries that set a limit to limit or completely even eliminate the possibility of change or challenge, let alone radical reform. So what I'm saying is these ideas of Muslim women and idea of Sharia are walls that we have to hit against, that we're constantly hitting against, almost to the point where there is no reform allowed, no changes allowed, because these are the walls that we're hitting against. So I want you to bear this in mind as we talk about what approaches there have been to gender within the space. The next thing is also to give you an idea of Sharia, of Islamic law. So many of the 19th and 20th century reforms that happened around Islamic law have been theorized as coming to an idea of Sharia as something solid, something specific, something unchangeable. So it's like a hardened notion of Sharia. My assessment of what has happened with gender reform is that this idea of Sharia is being exploded. It's being opened up. It's being asked questions. So let's talk a bit about what Sharia is. We can get to the next slide. Yes. So There's about 4 slides here that I want to use to talk a little about Sharia. So it's often misunderstood as the idea of a whole set of laws and rules. We move from the Arabic word Sharia, which means a path, a road, a way to something. But we have the idea very often that it is this long set of rules, and if you open the Quran, you're going to find the Sharia in it. So open it, it's there. Unfortunately, it's not what it is, but it's a popular opinion of what it is. People have described it as ethics and norms, a set of ethics, a set of norms, that comes from the processes of pious living, that it is the aspiration that a religion has to shape all aspects of the adherent's life. That it is a discussion on the duties of Muslims. What is important is to differentiate it from the idea of fiqh, the word at the bottom, F-I-Q-H. Now, fiqh is where you'll find positive laws. It's in the fiqh that you actually have a record and a statement of what you do when, how you do it. The Sharia, rather, is an ethical set of ethical principles that sit above this. The distinction is important because the Sharia is often more easily argued as the divine intention, the intention of the divine, whereas the fiqh is understood as the human interpretation of the intention of the divine. So the fiqh is where people come in. The Sharia is where the divine sits. Not to say that those distinctions are so clear anyway. So let's not get into that trap and say that it's clear. But it's important to know this distinction, right? If you go to the next slide. We'll see the idea that Sharia is an idea of religious morality rather than rules. It's an idea of religious morality, whereas fiqh is more specifically the efforts of legal reasoning. Coming from the various verses of the Quran. And what is important to know in fiqh is that the laws are produced in various levels of compliance, so to speak. So there are laws that say what you are required to do, what you are forbidden from doing, what you should do, what's recommended, what is disapproved, and what is, whether or not you do it, it's okay. So these are the gradations of the law, right? Is it good now?
Try now, try
Yeah.
now.
It is. Yeah, we keep going. Okay, there's people online. Yes. So yeah, so what I'm interested in is that we keep the question open, right? I call this, I speak about this as remaining interested and invested in the boundary between these intellectual traditions, right? I call this sitting in difference, sitting in the difference that exists between these two intellectual traditions. And the challenge is to resist, when you're in the space between the two traditions, is to resist the impulse to conflate them and say, oh yes, Islamic feminism is a must, is a necessity. It's actually the only kind of Islam that's a good Islam, is a feminist Islam. We like to say that. So resist that. And at the same time, resist the idea, resist the impulse to explode them so far apart that they can never come together. So this is what I want to advocate as our political stance when we're talking about gendered approaches to Muslim family, that we don't sit in that place where we have to have this wonderful Islamic feminism, or we have to pretend like they cannot exist together. This requires that we engage the space of tension between the two traditions. Also that we don't privilege one tradition over the other. So it's about not privileging either intellectual tradition. We don't get to, we ought not to be, I'm suggesting we do not privilege the intellectual tradition that is feminism over the intellectual tradition that is Islam, or the intellectual tradition of Islam over the intellectual tradition of feminism. Right? So amongst my arguments is that Islamic feminism may appear to be the inevitable result of the convergence of Islam and feminism. But I also want to argue that it is inadequate to concerns for sexual equality in Islam as an analytic construct. It could very easily, if it's not careful, if it is not aware, if it is not constantly critical, it could very carefully preclude new understandings of sex difference, which originate outside of a feminist paradigm. And so that's why I say it may be inadequate. But I do say it is inevitable. It may seem inevitable because it's kind of like, well, what else are you going to call it? Or we've got all these wonderful tools from feminism, why shouldn't we use it? And I'm okay with it being inevitable. So I use it. I just want us to be constantly critical with it. Right? So now you have an idea of Islamic law. You have a small amount of skepticism about Islamic feminism. Not too much, don't throw it out, keep it. But a little bit of skepticism within it. And so we can get into the ways in which gender has been approached in Islamic law. How am I doing for time? What do I have? Another 20 is okay? 30, okay. How are you? Are you okay to sit for another 20? It's long, I know that. You want to break, comfort break? No? Okay.
No, it's actually
It's okay, right? Keep going. Say when you can handle it anyway. Okay, so okay, we can move to the next slide. So there are, yeah, there's a bunch of historical approaches, right? And these are some of the people who worked on it historically early on. There are various books associated with them. I've shared with you their names. If you have the article, all the references are all in the article as well, right? So you'll find them there. But I present them just to show that these are some of the early ways of approaching gender. I find them primarily polemic, especially Murtaza Mutahari, whose work comes out of the Iranian Revolution, Abdurrahman Doi, Jamal Badawi, polemic responses to Western critics of Islam and gender. And importantly, commonly, they all seem to advocate the idea of gender complementarity, right? The idea that men and women, that people are either men or women, that men and women have particular roles, that they ought to maintain their roles, stay in those roles, that these roles complement, and that all you have to do to live a good Muslim life is fulfill your role. Right? So this is the idea of gender complementarity. Then there were some people, some scholars who offered us reinterpretive approaches within some of this gender complementarity. Kokab Siddiqui offered an almost revolutionary kind of approach because he spoke in revolutionary terms. He spoke about Muslim women in struggle. He spoke about turning social society. He spoke about societies operating in very different ways. Then there was Asghar Ali Engineer, who had one of the most sustained engagements on Muslim women, gender, and Islamic law, and very early on offered us some very valuable concepts which many of us continue to use, challenging normative gender dynamics and offering a robust support for a rights-based narrative. Even much earlier than this was Hassan Turabi in the Sudanese context, who actually spoke about women as equal subjects of Islamic law. Now that work was actually lost very early. Very few people followed up on Turabi's thought. And so we didn't get to see too much of that later on. Moving on to the next slide, 3 approaches to feminist legal reform, which I have categorized as reinterpretive, reconstructionist, and an ethical approach. And I'll give you examples of each of them amongst the scholars here. So the first amongst them is Aziz al-Hibri, a US scholar who also later developed a group called Karama, an NGO which does training for lawyers, which does all sorts of community advocacy as well. And to summarize Hibri's approach, he argues that the patriarchal bias evident in the law is a relic of a patriarchy that survived the clear injunctions of the Quran to the contrary. So this is the idea that the Quran speaks about equality, but what we have in law is inequality which survives beyond the Quran, despite the Quran. So this is a common opinion, a common approach that some feminist scholars have taken, that the idea that the Quran encompasses equality, that the law in fact gave us inequality because patriarchy that existed in the environment in which the Quran came ruled over the ideals of Quran. So she said it prevented interpreters from seeing the truths of the Quran, and it delayed the advent of the ideal family and society, which scholars like her say is more obvious now because we're doing this kind of thinking we're supposed to do. So she speaks of a historical failure to recognize the reality of the Quran. In the next slide. So she also speaks about the idea that there are tensions in women's experiences of the law, right? She says, while women have rights to property, divorce, and lifelong financial support from males in the family, the law fails women at significant points in their life. For example, the law allows women to be easily divorced and left penniless after many years of marriage. So she's sitting in the idea that Quran offers one thing, the reality is offering something else, and Muslim women have this dissonance in their experience. They're not getting what they should be getting, essentially. She blames a lot of it on cultural bias in the law, at the root of the dilemma being the distinction between religion and culture. So the equality of the Quran she would identify with religion, the patriarchy of society she would identify with culture. So this is a very particular reading that does not necessarily see patriarchy within the Quran, right? It sees it as outside of the Quran. So the next slide. A reinterpretive approach generally relies on an adherence to the internal rules of Islamic jurisprudence, namely the use of classical methods of understanding and coming to know the law, what is known as usul al-fiqh, the sources of the law. So it relies on the historical systems of understanding the law. It relies on theories such as public interest, the avoidance of harm, the tools of ijtihad, you might have heard this word, legal reasoning. So it relies on these tools to arrive at better interpretations of the law for the contemporary situation. Some of the examples are the revival of the Muslim marriage contract. This is part of the work of the reinterpretive approach. Lots of people have revived the Muslim marriage contract, and so you'll find young couples when they're getting married will be encouraged to go and have a discussion around marriage, talk about what's going to be in their contract. And so some of us who counsel young couples will talk to them about ensuring they have stipulations around polygyny, stipulations of how they can divorce, what are the mechanisms for divorce. So this is about using the contract to know what Islamic marriage is and then to frame the marriage the way you want it. There's a strong distinction, like I said, between religion and culture. And culture in this context is often considered un-Islamic, as though it is not Islamic. It is not meant to be, or it is not conforming with what is Islamic. And what is Islamic is thought to be what is Quranic, what is within the Quran. The next approach amongst the scholars is a conceptual approach. This conceptual approach does two things. It deconstructs and then reconstructs, right? Ziba Mir Hosseini is a good example of this kind of work. And Ziba highlights the disjuncture between women and law as a historical one that results out of the inner contradictions between the ideals of Islam and the social norms of early Muslim cultures. Sounds a bit like what Aziz Al-Hibri was doing. But what Ziba does is it makes a very clear distinction between Sharia and fiqh. And she has very clear interest in deconstructing the categories of the association between rights and gender, between rights and sexuality. Asking that we sever that link, that should not be the operative link when we're determining rights. A person's gender shouldn't be the basis on which we determine their rights. So she asks for a move away from the fiqh wisdoms, the old fiqh wisdoms, new ideas of gender difference, rather than working with the old assumptions of gender difference. She also questions the revealed assumptions. So she questions the Quranic assumptions, saying that those assumptions reflect the patriarchy of the time of revelation. And we don't have to continue in those assumptions today. We can move. In fact, we have moved, and so society should be responding differently. She redefines the boundary between morality and legality. So there's a lot of times when someone does something that is wrong, or wrong but not entirely wrong. For example, I'll give you an example: divorce through the process of talaq, which is to pronounce a divorce. Ideally, it should happen in front of witnesses, after a process of consultation, when everybody is sure that we've discussed our marriage, and now we're going to end it. It should happen that at that point, a husband pronounces the end of the marriage. But very often, what will happen is the nature of divorce is such that it is full of anger and pain and all of that. And so summarily, instantly, a husband can say talaq and pronounce the word, and when pronouncing the word, actually end the marriage, whether or not you wanted it. So this is a place where you've done something wrong, but not maybe actually wrong, in the sense that what you've done, you can't be held accountable for it. There's no place in the world I can go and get you held accountable for it. If there's a nation state that recognizes, if there's a law in state, then I can take you to prison, or I can take whatever measures the law said would follow through. But in terms of your own personal accountability, you are accountable to God. And if you violated the ethics of how to do a divorce, your accountability is to God, and only God can then hold you accountable. So this is what I'm saying, where she asks for that division between the ethics or the moral and the legal to be shifted. Because if I can't hold him accountable for pronouncing a divorce instantly, because that's in terms of his conscience between himself and God, then the person who's divorced instantly bears the brunt of it. And this is the way in which, maybe if you are struggling to understand Islamic law as a moral code, it helps you now to understand this is how it is a moral code beyond a legal code. So it doesn't sit exclusively in either one space. It sits in that intermediate space between the two. So what she says is the inequality in fiqh. Remember we said fiqh is the positive law, Sharia is the ethics that moves above it. The inequality in fiqh, she says, is not a manifestation of the intention of the divine. It's not a manifestation of divine justice. Very clearly, it is a construction of male jurists. Now, if you want to go back to the picture that you took of the sources of the law, you'll remember there was the consensus of the jurists, right? So this is where she's working in there. If you go back to Aziz al-Hibri, there was the Quran and interpretation of the Quran. So Aziz al-Hibri was working in that little spot. I'm saying this just so you can see that the scholars are working within the paradigms of Islamic law, doing different things. So the conceptual deconstruction approach. Sorry, just let me catch up with my notes. Central to the approach is a challenge to the historical understandings of women's sexuality. The intention is to sever the link between rights and sex difference. So rather than defining women's sexuality and the associated gender-based rights in terms of woman's nature or divine will, Ziba Mir Husseini asks for a social constructionist view that meets contemporary understandings of society and family. So the shift is designed to move away from these old fiqh wisdoms that she speaks about. Move beyond the letter of or the systems of the law, and become concerned with the concepts underpinning the application of the law. She also works with lots of NGOs, mostly these days with a group called Musawa, an international NGO which now has representation at the UN. She's also worked with women living under Muslim laws. And you'll find a lot of this deconstruction approach present in a lot of the NGOs. I've just named some NGOs here for you to have an idea of who they are. You can go and look them up. The last one, Full Disclosure, is a group that I work with. We a very small group. We have a small little Facebook page. We started as a WhatsApp group. We continue as a WhatsApp group, completely unfunded. But this is the places where the work is happening. Because I think you are also interested in movements and movement building. So this is, if you want to know, but this is where the work is happening in little spaces. We have a Facebook page. You can find us there if you're looking to know more. The final approach is an approach which is just catch up. What I call an ethical approach. And this is the approach that Keisha Ali represents very well. So she's offered us a different way of thinking of the intersections of sex difference, sexuality, and law by offering an ethical analysis of sexuality-focused legal norms. There's a lovely book called Sexual Ethics and Islam. Easy to read, very accessible. If you're looking for something to occupy an evening, certainly recommend that. It's a really good book. So she, her analysis also goes beyond marriage and divorce. She's expanded it into racial difference, religious difference, discrimination, power and authority, relationships of hierarchy. So she extends some of the questions that Zibamir Husseini begins with, but then takes it into an analysis of how ethics, what are the ethics of Islamic law? What are the ethics, what are the feminist questions, what are the questions of feminist ethics in Islamic law? What are the questions that feminist ethics brings to Islamic law that requires radical revisioning, radical reassessment, radical rethinking of Islamic law? So she says, for example, the traditional scheme of marriage is compromised beyond repair. So she argues for a new paradigm of marriage. Someone else who does this kind of work is Asif Qureshi, who's offered a view of marriage as partnership rather than the current paradigm of Islamic marriage, which actually functions through ownership. So this is the work of Keisha Ali. An ethical analysis requires an engagement with the Islamic intellectual heritage, and this is aimed at renewing and reinvigorating Muslim ethical thought. But she's also careful about how she engages the historical thought. She's very practical. She puts the utility of the Quran as a source of egalitarian reform in strong perspective. She says the Quran itself poses challenges to those who are committed to egalitarian social and intimate relationships. So she's opening space for questioning there as well. The next slide just shows a bit about the ethics-based reform. It asks for comprehensive rethinking of Islamic sexual ethics and ethics of sexual intimacy, understanding what is the meaning of consent and meaningful consent and mutuality. She speaks about a new jurisprudence. Someone else who does a similar work, excuse my spelling error there. Yeah, spelling error, it's Saadia Sheikh, who also offers a philosophy of sex difference sourced from historical writings of scholar Ibn Arabi. So these are just to show you that there's more than one person, there's lots of people doing this work. So, the next slide. The reinterpretive approach allows for new ways of reading the law in new circumstances. For example, it allows new approaches to a marriage contract. The conceptual deconstruction approach allows ordinary individuals to challenge the ways in which the law is represented in Muslim minority context. It allows a distinction between religious practice and non-religious or cultural practice. An ethical approach allows for a much more radical revisioning of the ethical principles underpinning the practice of law. Now, in addition to this, I want to also offer you, you've got 3 already, now we're going to do 4. So brain switch mindset. You got your 3, now we move to 4 narratives of subjectivity, which I'd like to share with you. You already have encountered the first, the complementarity narrative, right? That women as subjects of law are complements to men, and so the law functions in this idea of complementarity. You've also encountered the second one already quite a bit, the idea of human rights, right? When Zibamir Husseini spoke about equality, she was speaking in a rights context. Similarly, Aziza Hibri speaks about rights in a human rights context. If you're looking for work specifically on this, the work of Shaheen Sardar Ali, who actually looks at human rights and Islam and does this compatibility work with them, right? It works on the idea that women are equal in all aspects of the law. There's two other narratives which I think are interesting, and so that's why I want to share them with you. One is the narrative that speaks about being women as a legal disability. The idea that when we conceptualize, when we speak about women, we're actually speaking about a legally disabled subject, because that subject doesn't hold the fullness of the male legal subject. It argues that the male legal subject is the normative subject of the law, right? And this you all remember from feminist approaches to law 101. The normative subject of the law is the male subject of the law. And in Islamic law, we argue that it is the free adult, sane male, because those are the elements that determine a person's legal status. Enslavement to freedom, gender, sanity, or mental competence. And what do they say the fourth one is? Free male. Adult, exactly. Whether you're a child or an adult, right? So that determines your legal capacity. How can you be held accountable in the law, whether you're a child or an adult? So that's the third idea. And the person who speaks a bit about that is Judith Tucker. I've also done work on this within my PhD, which I haven't yet published. But so if you're looking for work on it, you'll find it still in the PhD form. But the idea that subject of the law remains male. And then there's a fourth narrative, which I find very interesting, which is the idea that Keisha Ali also talks about. It is the idea that the law functions with women as specifically married subjects. That the law actually has a concept of women as married, rather than women generally as women. Now that's very interesting for decolonial work, because it gives us a tool that comes from within the tradition to talk about the wife as a subject of law, rather than a woman as a subject of law. It's counterintuitive for us as feminist scholars, because we want to talk about women encompassing all. But when we do that, I think we lose a very important distinction for the ways in which wives are separated out in law. And I think if we're interested in that, we may be able also, and I say maybe because I haven't yet tried it, but anybody who's looking for the research project, here's something. Try what it would be to investigate the concept wife in the laws that you are familiar with. Any laws, set of laws that you are familiar with. What does the concept wife do? What is the concept wife expected to do? What is the legal category wife doing in law? How does the legal category wife work? Because I believe there is a legal category unannounced, even in our laws. Unannounced, unspoken, but there's a category wife that we think or we wish would be equal across, whether it is with the category husband or with the category woman. But my suspicion is that it isn't so simple, that it's a lot more complex. So I shared these four narratives because I thought it would be a good idea for you to just get to know them a little bit. And then let's go to the next slide. Okay, I've spoken to you already about Judith Tucker, and I won't continue in detail with Judith Tucker. I'll share these slides with you so you can have them, you can read some of this. But let's go to this. What does all of this mean? The next one. Yeah. What does this mean for legal reform? Right. So a large part of the legal reform work about rests on the lived experiences of Muslim women who inhabit various measures of conformity or resistance to Islamic law. The elements that are central to gender-based legal reform are a re-engagement with the historical legal tradition and a call for accountability or a recognition of the ethical aspects of legal obligations in everyday living. The third element speaks to what I call the faith factor or the faith risk which is how I refer to the disjunct between Muslim women's expectations of the law and their experiences of the law. The dissonance begins when women approach the law seeking and indeed faithfully expecting justice from the law. I mean, if I'm a believer and I approach my belief system looking for justice, I should get justice out of the system that I believe in. But in the reality of the experience being injustice. So in nation-state contexts, reform is a challenge to the state. But in minority context, reform is a challenge to local religious authority, and more specifically, the authority of the local community. And it's this latter aspect that animates the reform process in terms of the ways in which gender operates in Muslim familyhood. These various approaches to the law originate over many decades, and they all now function simultaneously in various Muslim contexts. They also remain at play in my own context in South Africa, which we'll speak about the next time we meet. The normative modern narrative in studies on women in Islamic law has been, from the beginning, that women and men are complementary, that the female subject of the law complements the normative subject. And by contrast, critical studies have taken issue with the privileging of the male legal subject to argue against sex difference as the primary distinction. Commonly, however, both normative and critical studies constitute the female legal subject through a narrative of tension between women and men, or equality and inequality. Though each suggests a different approach to women as legal persons, they come together in positing a female legal subject in tension with a male legal subject, who operates in a dual and at times contradictory manner. None of these frame themselves on a non-binary model of sex and gender difference. And this is a gap. We can move to the next slide. In newer readings, scholars like Ash Geisinger look at the construction of other genders beyond male-female distinction. They look at the historical readings of Quran and the Hadith. Similarly, Indira Gesik highlights the existence of other gender and sexual identities within the pre-modern Muslim legal context. These include categories of gender such as khunta, and the word khunta symbolizes a range of fluid gendered identities, not exclusively female, male or female. So there is that work that is new and now emerging. Another important terminology is the concept of mukhanna, the effeminate and effeminate masculinity, also spoken of in the prophetic traditions. So this too is a new area of work. The idea of the khunta mushkila, which is a person of indeterminate intersexuality, is also a historical category. Now, what is important here is to understand that these terms are not marginal to Islamic legal texts. These are historical terms. They're not terms that were introduced lately. They exist in texts from the 9th and 10th centuries. So why have they not featured until yet in our analysis? I think part of it is because, like many modernized traditions, our modern traditions have very much been straightened. They've had all the queer removed from them, all the difference, all the alternative removed from them, because we want very much to adhere to and feel like we conform to Victorian ideas of sexuality and gender difference. So I call this a straightened tradition. Ash Geisinger says that the considered categories, as well as normative sexual desires and practices, are central to the project of empire. So empire requires the straightened sexualities. It doesn't work in those spaces of alternatives and queer sexualities and difference. It likes clear categories. I'm almost done. So returning to our concern for a decolonial appreciation of all of these reform efforts. You'll remember, I asked you to remain a little skeptical. Just see, where's my next slide? Yes. So I asked you to remain a little skeptical of Islamic feminism, not entirely, just somewhat. And the reason for this is because I also want to remain committed to a decolonial understanding of gender and efforts for reform, especially those currently underway in my context, which is in South Africa. And many of these approaches have already featured on the South African scene. So moving forward, if you return to Sarah Ahmed's advice for living a feminist life, the ideas of Muslim women and Sharia function as, I said, as these deterministic screens. These are the concrete walls that we have to come up against as we do reform. So here's a few notes I'd like us to bear in mind. Firstly, that the convergence of Islam and feminism in the area of feminist Muslim legal studies must remain inadequate, even while it may seem inevitable, even necessary for this convergence to occur. What I mean by this is that we cannot become comfortable with the association too easily. We must remain vigilant of this intersection and constantly demand that these two intellectual traditions remain in tension, being attentive to what the tension releases into the space between the two boundaries. And furthermore, move beyond the binaries, whether it's the binary of the boundaries of these two intellectual traditions, or the binary of the sexualized and gendered bodies that these traditions work with. Then I think the reform options must come from Muslim women's and queer people's experiences of the law. We cannot ignore the coloniality of gender, nor the demand for consonance, for agreement between expectation and experience of justice. Thirdly, I think reform options must ask Muslim and queer individuals, reform options that do ask Muslim and queer individuals to abandon the religious legal commitments. They're not viable. Unless they also offer a new system of law derived from within the Muslim paradigm, articulated within the interests of Muslim communities. Finally, I think we must pay attention to the margins of Muslim communities. The border work must not be ignored for the center. The peripheries are where the dissenters reside. It's clear, certainly where I live. And their commitment to remain connected, I think, offers the most potential, the most potent potential for reform. I will end there and hope that giving you some of the pieces also will ask questions. Thank you.
Essa abertura? Começar?
Good morning, Professor. My name is Amanda. Thank you so much for your talk. I would like to ask. I'd like to ask about a point you touched on earlier, when you mentioned that several acrobatics were done in order to reinterpret traditional law. And I was very curious in understanding from where specifically these acrobatics came from. I really have to acknowledge that I know very little about how about the administrative organization of the state, so I wouldn't know exactly how to phrase my question. If I were to use terms that would make sense for us here, would this kind of acrobatic change come from the legislative or the judiciary branch? This is something I think about a lot because for us here, and I've talked to people in very different contexts, like in Japan, for example, that study law, and they have mentioned that they feel the judiciary for them could be a big potential in terms of advancing rights when the legislative will not. But on the other hand, their judiciary branch won't do that. So that's one of the claims they have. And I was wondering if what it was like in these changes of interpretation, these acrobatics you mentioned. Sure.
Take a few.
Mais alguém? Nesse momento?
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question if there are some perspectives on gender also in Islamic international law. Some discussions about that, or some perspectives.
Acho que não funcionou o microfone agora. Tá baixo, então aumenta um pouquinho, porque o pessoal lá atrás não escutou. Fala mais alto, mesmo.
I would like to know only if there are some perspectives on discussing gender in Islamic international law.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the movements that you mentioned and what are the strategies and how they are facing those ideas of reform and dealing with law and the main objects and strategies that they mobilize.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So in terms of these acrobatics, what is important to know is the way in which Islamic law is produced. Islamic law, and this is the difficulty even when you use the category Islamic law, whether you think about it as a codified law in the state, or whether you think about it as that list of content page there, which is sitting in a fiqh textbook. So where is Islamic law? Where does it sit? My argument is that it sits in our experience of it. That is where it sits. But where it gets produced is in discussions and in processes of thinking amongst legal scholars, right? Within scholarly circles, any person who's trained in Islamic law, you'll go through a school of training, you'll be trained in one particular tradition, or you might train in more than one tradition. And any kind of work you're going to do reinterpretation or even to do application of the law, you are required to remain loyal to the school within which you were taught and to take opinions from within the school, right? You can take opinions from other schools, but mostly you're required to take opinions from your school. So what has happened with Islamic finance law is that scholars have come together in councils, in collectives, to contemplate and think about what the requirements and the needs are for contemporary finance, which meets the principles of Islamic financing, the major one of which is that income is not earned from interest, from usury, right? So a lot of the work is centered on how can you be economically active, how can you do finance without earning from interest. So scholars come together and they have discussions, or an individual scholar like themselves go into the texts, read the historical text, do a reinterpretation, use all the methods of reasoning, and come up with a new interpretation. So that's how it happens. The acrobatic part that I'm talking about is how interested people are in doing that, and how they work with all the different mechanisms that exist in the historical law, all the different techniques and methods. They're so willing to work with them to produce the kinds of outcomes that we want to have a thriving Islamic finance market, global finance market, right? It's massive, it's huge, it's in the billions. There's no similar appetite to do that kind of thinking, complicated, interesting, complex thinking around the realities of marriage, divorce, and inheritance. And that is where my gripe, that's where I get upset. That's why I say they do acrobatics, but they won't even move when it comes to marriage law, divorce law. And that is, we can certainly go back to Ziba Mir Husseini, who says it's the male gaze, it's male scholarship, right? What's happening now is there are new people, women are coming into the space. So if you're looking at movements, and I'll come to your question around some of the movements. I just came back late last year. I didn't just come back, it was late last year. I attended an invitation in Indonesia. There's this fascinating group called the Women's Ulama Congress. Ulama is the word for legal scholars. So the Women's Ulama Congress had its second Congress late last year. The first one was in 2017. What this is a group of people who've come together to assert themselves as legal scholars. Indonesia has a history of traditional schools where students went to learn Islam and did their general schooling. Students graduated out of that, and men and women, and having been trained in all the Islamic sciences. Male students came out of there and called themselves ulama, a scholar of Islam. Female students were never called that, but they had this training. And so often they could even be teaching these young men, but they were not called ulama. And at some point they decided they would call themselves scholars of Islamic studies. And so now they've called themselves that, and now they've had two massive congresses. And what they did in the first Congress was they gave themselves the task of writing new legal opinions. I can't remember all the topics, but the one that stayed in my mind in the first Congress was they wrote a new legal opinion, a new fatwa on child marriage. So they are now grouping themselves to do the work that we want done, which we've been waiting for male scholars to join, they've not been doing. So now they're doing themselves. This year, and you've got to appreciate the genius in what they're doing. They wrote 5 fatwas. They came together for 5 fatwas. There were 1,000 women from all around Indonesia in this conference. And through a process of really, really important, deep, really, really significant consultation in the community. They started a year before. They went into communities, took these 5 fatwa ideas, workshopped it in communities, and then brought it to a regional level. Thereafter, they brought those same people into the national, and at a national level, we workshopped it again. I was there for 5 days. 3 days was this conference. We workshopped these ideas again in small groups, and at the end of it, they produced these 5 fatwas. And one of them, talk about genius, how to use tradition to work in the interests of the contemporary. It's entitled a fatwa on the protection of women from rape-related pregnancy. The protection of women from rape-related pregnancy. So just hold that in your mind and contemplate the kind of work that's happening there. the kind of ingenuity, the kind of interest in feminist ideas of the body, of safety, entwined in a complex engagement with piety, with the need to be religious, with the need to follow your faith. And that is it's a very rich work. So you wanted to know. So this is Kupi, K-U-P-I, if you're looking for it. Look for Kupi. You are Kupi. This is Kupi. Kupi in Indonesia. Then there's this group, Musawa, which I've spoken about. Musawa has started about 10 years ago and is now engaged in a very strong project on Muslim family law reform. Their statement is that Musawa works for equality in the Muslim family. So this is their work. Musawa comes, and they're based in Malaysia. Musawa comes out of two earlier groupings. One is called Sisters in Islam, which is also Malaysian. Sisters in Islam has been the bane, that they are the thorn in the side of the Malaysian state. Malaysian state people keep trying to ban them, and they keep going to court and they're not banned because they're working within a constitutional context. So they're Sisters in Islam, and Sisters in Islam has been very valuable over the years. They're more than 20, 30 years old. They've been very valuable in producing ordinary, simple literature that will take a verse of the Quran and interpret it and understand it in a way that allows an equality perspective. So this is what they've done, or critiques the earlier interpretations and offers an alternative instead. So that's Sisters in Islam. Then there's Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which is even, I think, as old as Sisters, not older. And that was based in the UK, but it originated through women who were from Tunisia, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan. And I worked with them for a couple of years. They produced something called Knowing Our Rights. You can find this book. It's a beautiful, beautiful manual, Knowing Our Rights. And what they did was they went to, I think, about 63 countries. And in each of those countries, they had country teams. Those country teams went and researched practice of Islamic law in that Muslim family laws in that country. They brought those, they were given a template to record it in. They brought those templates into the international space. And this project took years. It took 10 years, this project. I came in at the late stage where we already had all the templates and we were now formulating it into the book. It's a brilliant book that goes through all these countries and talks about the legal practice. And a really nice tool that it has is at the end of each section, say it's a section on talaq, right? One form of Islamic divorce. It shows all the different practices in different countries, and then it ranks them, most option giving to least option giving. So what that did for those of us who were working in the area was it told us what was happening in other parts of the Muslim world. Because part of the challenge in reform is constantly being told that what you're doing is un-Islamic. It is not Islamic. Whereas if you can see that in other parts of the world they're doing it, then you can say, well, someone else is doing it. Maybe it's a little Islamic. Maybe I can do it. So that is really crucial in movement building, sharing knowledge of local practice, for us to know what each other does. That's really, really crucial. And to have that information accessible like that in a book, I used it for many, many years. It's now a little outdated because the book, I think, was finished in 2002 or something like that. And it's not being updated, but instead Musawa is now involved in a project to produce a more current version of something like that. So those are some of the movements. In Cairo, there's something called the Memory Forum. On the east, in the Horn of Africa, there's SIHA, the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, which is also doing a lot of law reform at the moment. Baobab, if BAB, is an old Nigerian organization, and quite honestly, I'm not sure where they are at now, but lots and lots of work historically done through Baobab. Those are some of the places that are coming off the top of my head, but I'm happy to also chat about others. And then there was the question about international law. So some of the challenges in speaking about Islamic law is that we tend to speak about it in the categories of Western law. So in terms of international Islamic law, there is a whole history of law which talks about borders and boundaries, which talks about war, which talks about ambassadorships, how to be an ambassador, who is an ambassador, how to have negotiations and agreements between countries. It's a long history of it, it's a long tradition. I don't know of any feminist work that's happening in it. It hasn't been an interest of mine, so I haven't checked. I could check for you, certainly. But that would be an interesting space to do it. What I know is that there's been lots of feminist readings of Islamic laws of war, the laws of capture, the laws of concubinage, all of which become part of international law. Yeah. It's,
Bom, eu vou tentar falar sempre o programa em inglês, não para ouvir, senão eu vou falar isso.
Yeah, I think now it's working. Congratulations for the great seminar. My question is, my name is David. My question is actually complementary to the one from Amanda. And to be honest, you kind of answered halfway through it already. I was interested on what's the state of the hermeneutics on the law hermeneutics on the Muslim culture and how you deal with the fact that you don't have a codified law that has books. I mean, basically, when you said that they were doing acrobatics,
financial
law. I was curious how those acrobatics works on a non-codified law. You kind of answered this halfway through. So my question now is, how exactly does the hermeneutics work? Are there official sources that deal with how exactly people portray the law? Is everything about the religious groups or the political forces? It's almost a curiosity at this point, given you already answered the more specific question.
Yes, incorrect.
Deixa eu aumentar pouquinho. Não. Fatima, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Just show us how little we know about many things. So it's so wonderful to hear you. It's absolutely new in all the senses and kind of blowing up many frames that we are used to put our thoughts. So I was really wondering if you could, I mean, I would love to hear about many things, but since I have this question to do, to hear a little bit more about, you said the way I could grasp, I mean, we have Shari, Fiqh, but then the state, no? And you put it so much emphasis on the dispute of narratives. And in some way, you added how it was important to have the historical interpretation of Sharia and Fiqh as well, in order to use as a tool, including faith as a tool to enforce new contemporary interpretation. So I was really interested on that particular emphasis on tradition and faith because in our Occidental idea of law and gender, we have to separate and have to take faith off the way. And I could notice that that was part of your suspicions of not take so seriously the separation. So that I'm quite interested in how, if you could talk a little bit more about your experiences of not taking for granted this separation. And I would just add that at some points of representation, you said experience, expectation, experience, and then in the end you said dissidence. So I really would love to hear more about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else? I'll append one myself very quickly. On one hand, you just said in response to it in the earlier round that Islamic scholarship is quite scholastic in the sense it's divided into schools, including then, I suppose, the feminist scholar landscape in a sense. Yeah? But then there is this concept of ummah in community, and you wonder in a sense how that squares. And whether you see the concept of the Islamic community as a whole is an opportunity for this feminist scholarship or a challenge in terms of questions of interpretive authorities and this. Great.
Okay. So yes, in terms of the hermeneutics, how does it function? So it functions in schools of law. So there are many schools of law. I mentioned just 4 because those have become the most common. There are many, many more, and there's disputes about which is and which isn't, and who's recognized and who's not recognized. But generally, the hermeneutics that you're speaking about, the interpretive tradition, what we call an interpretive tradition, sits within a school. And each school will have particularities about how it does interpretation. And this interpretive method of the school is transmitted from scholar to scholar to scholar, housed in texts that are known as the known texts or the known opinions of the tradition of that school. So there'll be, for example, the Hanafi school is named after Imam Abu Hanifa, right? So his opinions are authoritative. And then next to him are his 2 students, and their opinions hold similar authority to him. And then those who learned from those students, they would also have an opinion. And in that way, the opinion gets traced from the most senior scholar in the school through to other scholars. And when you go and learn in the school, you learn all those opinions. You're required to keep your own methodologies within the methodologies of the school. But that doesn't mean that the school is always closed. The methodologies are methodologies of legal reason. So you reason within the parameters of how your school reasons. It's wide enough that you can do acrobatics of finance law, right? But then it's also narrow enough that you can't do anything about talaq, about how divorce happens, right? So it's all the organizing principles of the legal fraternities in the school. More in contemporary times, we're seeing the schools also participate in councils. So people from different schools will end up being part of the council, the judicial council, which may have scholars from many, many schools. We've got some international fatwa councils that are operating, some national ones that operate. In South Africa, we have, for example, one council that is primarily from the Shafi'i school on the West Coast. The East Coast, there's a few judicial councils from the Hanafi school. So you don't have to have one. People group themselves into different ones. So there's a lot of self-regulation in the community of scholars. And what happens in a minority community, in a situation where Muslims are the minority, what happens is that those councils often get called upon to represent the Muslim community to the state. So they are called upon to represent the community of Muslims, but they are self-elected. There's no sort of democratic election of them. So you can imagine the kind of challenges that we end up with then, because there's almost never a queer imam on that council, for example. Right? There's never a queer leader on that council. So that's in terms of hermeneutics. Bethania, I don't know when I'll stop answering your question because it's big. So I think you're asking how not to set, what to do with this almost instinctive reaction to separate faith and law. I think you're asking about the separation. How do we work with the separation? How not to separate faith and law, and how does faith and tradition work? Is that what you were asking?
I mean, I was actually asking how interesting is to do not separate.
To not, yes. So it is very interesting for feminist scholars to have to engage with faith without telling people to put aside their faith. And that's a big thing. It's part of the reason why feminist scholarship doesn't really do religion. But there's a massive area of feminist Christian scholarship. I mean, there's all sorts of feminist Christian theology that works within the parameters of Christianity, similarly Islamic thought. And what I find most interesting is the ways in which feminist scholars have no problem working within other cultural paradigms. So we don't come into a society, into a US society and say, put aside all your US culture and now be feminist. No, we work within US culture to offer feminist readings of US culture, to offer feminist alternatives. But when it comes to religion, we demand religious people to put aside their religion and then become feminist. We struggle with how to be feminist and faithful. I think part of it is because there's a simplistic understanding that religion is the only place, or the only location of patriarchy. It is certainly a strong location of patriarchy. But to suggest that even when we are not working in religious spaces, that we are not working with religion is a fallacy, I think. I think even in non-religious spaces, even if you work with constitutionalism, you're working with religion, whether it's in ideas of morality, what is right and what is wrong. We can very often trace those religious origins for many of those ideas. So to assume and pretend like we're not working with religion, I think is our own, we do that to our own peril. Because the reason why, for example, the discussions around termination of pregnancy, Roe versus Wade, are happening in the US at the moment is because religion is deeply involved in those discussions of what appears to be secular work. It's supposedly secular. And Dalal Assad does a very good job of talking about how the secular is framed on the religious. Right? People are nodding their heads. So you've read this about how what is considered religion, what is considered secular, actually stands as shadow almost to what is the way in which religion has been framed. So yeah, we kind of have to not put aside faith, because then we can't do the work. And also then we leave all of this to the patriarchs. No, it's our work as well. So it's kind of a claiming. Yeah? And yes, to speak to your question about the idea of ummah, by which you mean the collective of Muslims, right? The idea that Muslims belong to a collective, a universal, global collective, and so share commitments and share certain interests. Does that work with or against the feminist Muslim scholarship? I think both, because of the concept of a nation, of a community. We can claim belonging. So anybody who wants to kick us out, we get to say we belong. They're interested in kicking us out, but also the nature of the Ummah being diverse allows us to remain connected to it. Whether we're a scholastic tradition is a critique that is made very often of feminist Muslim scholarship. We are frequently told that we are not scholastic in the way that the schools of law, for example, are scholastic traditions. And part of that is because if you want to train as become an alim, become part of the ulama, become a legal scholar, as a Muslim woman, you're not going to find a place to do it, except if you perhaps go to Indonesia, there's options. But outside of that, in the world, there's very, very little option. So I went to go and try to do some of this work and got to Cairo, and just to try to sit in a scholarly circle amongst scholars from the Azhar University. My male colleagues could just walk into the mosque and go and sit. I had to ask permission if I would be allowed. I would ask if I could sit. For me to get a teacher to teach me, I had to go through all sorts of hoops to get a teacher. But the fact is that I couldn't simply enroll in that university and go and attend. If I did attend that university, I'd have a curriculum for females given to me. So getting the knowledge, becoming scholars, is really a challenge. It's one of the reasons why, so I can just do a little bit of advertising. So we started this year at the University of Cape Town, a new program in Islam, gender and sexuality. Not that we think we're going to produce scholars of Islamic law, but just to have a place where you can actually do this work, as opposed to spending 10 to 15 years going to Cairo, going to Yemen, going to Sudan, looking, and you find nothing. We want to have a place where you can have something. So yeah, we're not those kind of scholars, but we think we're still scholars. Yeah.
Obrigada, gente. Eu vou só lembrar que hoje à tarde a gente continua, começa o mini curso da professora Marcela Gutierrez. Hoje ela fala de pensamento jurídico dogmático, pensamento jurídico complexo, justiça transicionais e justiça ancestrais. Amanhã de manhã a gente não tem palestra. À tarde continua o mini curso da Marcela Gutierrez. Na quinta, às 11, a gente vai ter a palestra do Eloy Terena, aqui mesmo no B6. E na quinta e sexta à tarde, a gente tem um mini curso da Fátima, em que ela vai poder desenvolver um pouco mais essas leituras, essas reconstruções que ela vem experimentando em relação a direito de família islâmico e a questão, tanto do matrimônio quanto do divórcio. Tá? Então, esperamos todos vocês nos mini cursos, vão ter lá no quinto andar, na sala da pós. E sexta de manhã, a palestra da FIB, às 11, né? Criando aí coalizões, construindo coalizões através de fronteiras estruturais como forma, né, de uma intimidade radical. Tá bom? Então, temos aí a semana inteira de trabalho. A FIB continua e vai ter os minicursos. As aulas dela vão ser na disciplina do doutorado, do obrigatório doutorado, de ética e princípios constitucionais. Então, quem quiser, depois a gente tenta garantir a participação também nas aulas da FIB, que vai ser no horário da aula de sextas-feiras, no dia 4 e no dia 11 de abril. De 11 às 2, a disciplina a disciplina é de 11 às 2, né?
A nossa
Então, aí o mini curso está dentro da disciplina do doutorado. Então, quem não estiver na turma do doutorado, para aproveitar também as aulas da FIB, aí a gente só ajuda a gente a se inscrever na secretaria, só para a gente ver se precisa de uma outra sala para comportar um número maior de pessoas, tá? Mas aí só não está ao longo dessa semana, porque a semana ficou cheia, né? E a FIB tem mais tempo com a gente. A Fátima e a Marcela ficam só essa semana. Aproveitem não só os mini-cursos, mas aproveitem também os outros momentos de almoço, conversem, troquem ideias, percebam que a gente tem aí essa semana Colômbia, África do Sul, Inglaterra, como possíveis, né, percursos de circulação de conhecimento entre nós. Vamos aproveitar. Tá bom? Obrigada pela presença de todo mundo.
Mas aí seria bem
Seria.
apoio, etc. Legal, viu? A gente tinha que arrumar nossos serviços para vocês.
Impressionante.